The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. The dark man fled across the white desert and Arthur followed. So we actually have some really good Easter eggs for Stephen King's work in Joe Hill's book King Sorrow. So come and join me for this video and find out what I thought about this massive tome written by Joe Hill. Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name's Mel and I like to review books. So today's video is my weekly video to discuss all of the books that I've read in the last week. And when we last left off last week, I had actually started reading a book which was not a Stephen King book, which I'm probably not supposed to be doing because at the moment I'm doing King Family February, so the majority of the books I'm reading this month are actually written by members of Stephen King's family or Stephen King himself. However, I'd had a very disappointing book last week with Owen King's The Curator, and that had led to a do not finish. And then I had a very successful read of Tabitha King's Small World, which I'd really enjoyed. And then I said I wanted to move on to King Sorrow by Joe Hill, but King Sorrow is just under 900 pages long, so it's quite, you know, a big book to read, so I knew I'd be reading that for pretty much the whole week. It's quite a commitment, so I just wanted something a little bit more light-hearted, just to sort of be a bit of a brain cleanser really before I got into that. So I'd actually picked up House of Monstrous Women by Daphne Farmer, and I was about 30% of the way through this at the last week's review session that we had. So I just thought before we get into Joe Hill's King Sorrow, I would just finish off reviewing this book and what I thought about it. Now, when I say something a little bit more simple, actually this wasn't a really simple read in the sense of it's not just sort of some kind of rom-com where it's not really that deep. This is actually really interesting and really intense, but it's not very long. It's only about 300 pages, so it still did the job, which was just resetting my brain before starting King Sorrow. But let's discuss this book. So this book came out in, I think it was about October or possibly the beginning of November in 2025, so it's not very old at all, only a few months old, and it's Daphne Farmer's debut novel as well. And I was really impressed with this novel. I'm not sure that I'm really into the haunted house novel as such. I think I want to be, but I haven't really read one so far to date that has been that interesting, although I think the premise of a haunted house is interesting. I would say that this is the best one that I've personally read so far, although I haven't read a huge amount of them. But essentially, you know, we're following our main character, who I think is called Josephine. You just gotta check. Yeah, Josephine. And this is happening in the Philippines, so it's set in the Philippines, and it's actually set in the 80s when the People's Revolution is happening, or like the lead up to the People's Revolution, and then it actually happens during this book. So our author, Daphne Farmer, she's not born in the Philippines, but her background is Filipino. So I think that her grandmother was living in the Philippines, and possibly her parents emigrated to America because Daphne Farmer was brought up in America in a Filipino community. And she sort of says in the end of this book that her grandmother would tell her these folklore stories, like Filipino folklore stories, you know, and the sort of superstitions that they had around those stories there, and, you know, the idea of sort of magic and black magic, I suppose. And that's really what this story is about. So it's sort of set, you know, in the Philippines, but during political unrest. And we follow Josephine from sort of childhood to adulthood. So she talks a little bit about her childhood and how, you know, the local folklore and superstitions affect the games that she plays and, you know, with the friends that she has, but also how people view the friends that she has whose families are considered to be invested in this kind of black magic that's local to that area. And then as she grows into an adult, she is invited by her childhood friend to come and stay at her house and play one of these games, which is heavily influenced by folklore, basically. So it's sort of like a game of hide and seek. And you have the seeker, who is essentially called an aswang, and that in the folklore there is basically this really dangerous magical entity that is gonna eat you, essentially. and then you have obviously the person who's trying to hide. And that is the essence of this book. So they play this game in childhood, and obviously nothing particularly comes of that because they're just children, and the Aswang are just a folklore tale. Nobody, I say nobody believes in them. The children don't really believe in them, but they're sort of scared of them. It's kind of like the boogeyman. However, some of the adults in the area really do believe in that idea. And so, the friend whose family are kind of like, not outlawed as such, but they're sort of shunned by the society there because they're considered to actually be Aswangs, which are like obviously the evil from this sort of make-believe game that they play. So even though it's sort of supposed to be light-hearted and it's not really supposed to be real, there's a lot of people who actually believe that this family have brought trouble on the village and that they are actually magic. So they sort of go away when our main character Josephine is younger. But then when she's an adult, her adult friend invites her to her house. So our character Josephine used to be really close friends with this woman who owns this house. So she goes, and a couple of the other childhood friends are invited to this house, and they're basically going to play this game where you have the hiders and the seekers, and essentially the seekers are supposedly Aswang. However, the adult version of the game is a lot more serious than the childhood version of the game, and this is where we get to see whether there's any truth in whether the Aswang are real or not. Now, this is a gothic horror novel, and I've got to be honest, like, the descriptions are absolutely beautiful of the landscape and the scenery, and also really intense for the terrifying situations that this character actually walks into. It's really, really descriptive. I would say if you're not really into gore horror, then you might potentially not like this because there are some quite graphic, detailed images of gore in this book. But I was really into this. I really enjoyed it. I think that the beginning of the book is a little bit slower to get going because we just sort of set in the scene, and the author kind of has to let us know what this folklore is, what is an Aswang, and sort of introduce all the characters and how they all tie into each other, and how the family who are sort of shunned for supposedly being magic, like how the community actually views that kind of thing, which I sort of was really glad that the author did, because I've never actually been to the Philippines and I don't know anything about Philippine folklore or magic or any of the kind of superstitions that they may have had there. But also in this book we need to set the political scene as well. So our characters are affected by the current political state of play at the time. She's been affected as a child, and it keeps continuing into her adulthood, and then we obviously have the People's Revolution, and that is woven into this story really, really well as well, and that's not something that I knew about until I read this book. So we have like a political aspect going on, and then we have like the folklore aspect of stuff going on as well in this book. I think the author did a really, really good job. So the beginning of the book is like maybe a bit slower, but we have all this beautiful gothic description of things that are going on, and then in the second half of the book it really picks up pace and becomes a page turner, and you literally have to find out not just what's going to happen to our main character Josephine, but what's going to happen to everybody else. I've never really read a horror like this before, but I was specifically looking for horror that investigated kind of black magic and folklore. I was really wanting a horror book to do that, and this did that really, really, really well. So I would say that this is a really, really good debut. I'd be really happy to pick up the next book that Daphne Farmer produces, because I think this was a really, really strong start to her career. I think if you're into like folklore horror, then you're probably going to really, really like this book. I think I would probably rate it about a 4.25. In a way I kind of maybe wish there was, but I think like what the actually is happening at the end of the book, where it sort of picks up pace and it's a page turner, I kind of wish we'd maybe got to that a little bit sooner in the book and there had been more of it, or if there had been more of it like in the childhood. So I can't say too much because I don't want to give away actually what happens at the end of this book, but I do think there's some really gruesome elements of this book, and the characters that are performing those elements that maybe we could have seen a little bit more of in the childhood to prepare us for this later on, possibly. But I'll give it a 4.25. I think it's really strong and I really, really enjoyed it. So then, obviously, after I've read House of Monstrous Women, I have then picked up Joe Hill's King Sorrow. Now, this, as I said, is a bit of a beast. It's just under 900 pages long. And I got this as part of my Goldsborough subscription for October. But I think it actually arrived right at the end of October or possibly the beginning of November, so I wasn't able to put it in my spooky reads. But then saying that as well, with it being so big, it's not really something that I could have just read at the end of October in about 3 days. So I did have to dedicate probably about 4 or 5 days to reading this one. But it's really stunning. I mean, look at the sprayed edges, and if we look inside the book as well, like these dragon scales are just really pretty, and I just think that, you know, it's really, really nice. My copy is actually signed by Joe Hill as well, so you get that as part of your Goldsborough subscription. So I didn't really know what to expect from this book. I knew that it was like fantasy horror, and that was about it. And my experience reading with Joe Hill so far is quite limited. So I read his debut novel, Heart-Shaped Box, and I thought it was okay, but I didn't think it was as good as, you know, people made it out to be. I thought that the idea was really good, but the execution of it was not as strong as I'd have liked. And there was a bit of wasted storytelling for about 100 pages in the middle where I just sort of thought that the story needed to get going. So, you know, that was my first experience of him. And then I went to read a short story collection that he wrote, which was 20th Century Ghosts, although my copy was called The Black Phone. I think they recovered the collection after The Black Phone got released at the cinema. Anyway, I really enjoyed that short story collection. I thought it was quite quirky and sort of showed me that actually he's actually quite a good storyteller. You know, and I can't remember when Heart-Shaped Box came out, but it was a really, really long time ago. Anyway, this one came out, as I said, in October 2025, and there was about a 10-year gap between this book and the last one that he'd ever actually published. But I've got to be honest, I think it was worth it because I think he did a really good job in this book. So I will say now, of the 3 of his that I've read, this is definitely winning in my opinion. I think the writing has really matured from Heart-Shaped Box. I think the storytelling was a lot more complex, the characters were more complex. And I also really enjoyed the fact there was quite a lot of Stephen King Easter eggs in here, which I really wasn't actually expecting. Now, I was surprised to find them in Tabitha King's book last week, but we had even more in this book. And with the ones that I found in this book, I almost feel like that this story has been set in Stephen King's universe. So, for starters, I've opened up in the intro with reading out the first line of The Gunslinger, which is the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. Now, that to me, I've just read that the other week because I read The Gunslinger in the first week of King Family February, and then in King Sorrow, you know, I'm reading the line, the dark man fled across the white desert and Arthur followed, and then we also had the line, the dark men fled across the cold desert and Arthur Oakes followed, which is very similar, a couple of lines down from the first one. This can't possibly be an accident. I think that was done on purpose, but I think it works really, really well in this novel. Now, there's a lot more comparisons that I can make, which I'm going to do as I go through this, but it's going to be really difficult. I really need to try and compare it, well, not compare it, but pull out the Easter eggs from the other novels without actually giving the endings of the other novels away, just in case that you haven't read them. But I would say overall that in my mind, this is Joe Hill's version of Stephen King's It, essentially. Because we have a fantasy creature, in this one it's a dragon, in It it's, you know, a clown and takes off many other forms as well in It, but basically Pennywise is a clown. And that fantasy creature requires imagination to summon them, and because of this, a group of friends become locked in a pact for the rest of their lives in order to deal with this fantasy creature. That's what happens in It in a nutshell, and this is essentially what's happening in King Sorrow in a nutshell. But I also think that it's potentially Joe Hill's modern day retelling of, you know, Arthur and Guinevere, because, you know, our character Arthur Oakes, who is one of our main characters, he has British roots, And in here we also have a righteous sword as a weapon that's brought out. We have a dragon, and we also have a love interest called Gwen. So yeah, I do sort of think that there's obviously a big nod towards, the Arthur stories, legends, tales, if you like, with dragon. I think, we have to make that comparison with this. But I suppose, the overall arching point of this story, I would say, is that two wrongs don't make a right. If we're literally going to sum it up in a sentence. So I feel like that sounds really, really cryptic, so I should probably tell you a little bit more about it. But essentially, we have our main group of characters. There are probably between about 18 and 20, like split across the 6 friends when they start off on this story. And this story starts in 1989 and it carries on up until 2022. So it spans like 33 years. So a bit like it follows our characters over several decades. However, our characters are like about a decade older when they start with the King Sorrow story in comparison to it, where our characters are like 11, 12 years old. So basically, our characters meet each other in, I think it's like they're in college. Initially, I thought they were in high school, but actually I realised that they were in college. Like, some of them are juniors and some of them are seniors. But they all like hang around their friend's house. And one of them, Arthur, he starts getting into a bit of trouble with some, well, they're not exactly bullies, but they are an outside influence. And essentially, we meet one of our main protagonists, which is Jane Nyswander. And I think that that's like an awesome name, Nyswander. And she has a sister called Tanna, who also becomes a main character, but also her mother, Daphne Nyswander, also becomes one of the protagonists in this story. Anyway, they cause in Arthur some trouble, and as a result of this, they summon a dragon, and they end up in a pact with this dragon, and then this is what takes them through the decades, is them trying to deal with this dragon. So I'm not going to go more into the details of it, but I think that it's really interesting for me because I wasn't sure that I was going to like a story with a dragon, but it's not like the sort of fantasy story where, I don't know, where it is like Arthur and Guinevere or whatever, where you're in this sort of mystical realm with dragons flying around and all the rest. It's not actually happening. This story is actually happening in Maine, but we can basically have this dragon summoned. And I think, like, basically the dragon is just meant to represent like a mirror to these friends, to indicate to them to look at themselves and try to understand what evil really is. So obviously our dragon is evil because it goes around eating people, essentially. But the way that they have to fight this dragon is where essentially we come to the point of two wrongs don't make a right. And so they may look at this dragon and think that it's evil, but it also forces them to look back at themselves and think about the choices that they are making, during this adventure to get rid of this dragon, as to, are they actually really any better than this dragon? And this is actually what ties us into one of Stephen King's other novels where we saw some Easter eggs, which is The Dead Zone. So The Dead Zone was published in 1979, and there's a line in here which says, "Killing only sows more dragon's teeth." And this phrase is actually repeated in this book as well. And I think that it's perfectly apt for this, because essentially that means the act of violence or aggression to get rid of, a conflict will only sow more seeds for further conflict and aggression. So that's one way that we're sort of linked to this book. But right at the start of this book mentions in King Sorrow about a politician called Greg Stilson. And the moment that that name was mentioned, I was like, well, that's interesting, because I remember that character from The Dead Zone. Now, initially, I had to do a little bit of searching on the internet because I'm not really up too much on American politics from the 80s. So I wasn't really sure if Greg Stilson was actually a real candidate that had tried to stand for presidency, or if it was just a fictional character of Stephen King's made up for The Dead Zone. But it actually is just a fictional character of Stephen King's made up for The Dead Zone. So therefore, we have a very direct link between this world and this world. So this is set in Castle Rock, Maine, in the Dead Zone, and in King Sorrow, we know that it's set in Maine, but we don't exactly know where. So we haven't had Joe Hill call it Castle Rock. But there's also a link to Derry from It, which is also in Maine, but it's not in Castle Rock. So I think we can safely say that King Sorrow is set in the same universe as Stephen King, for the fact that we actually have a character that is mentioned in this book who is a politician in this book, and he's also a politician in King Sorrow. So it's not a mistake. Now, this character, Greg Stilson, I think is really interesting because when he was written into the Dead Zone in 1979, he's written as a politician who has come from nothing. He hasn't really had any training to be a politician. He has made himself into a self-made businessman, and he has some very populist ideas about how government should be run. And when he is trying to be, when he's going for, different elections, he's actually doing really, really well. And everybody thought he was a bit of a joke, and nobody really thought that he would get very far. Now, you can probably think in the modern day, I know who that sounds like. Now, obviously, Stephen King did not write this about any modern day politician, because obviously this was written in 1979, so he had absolutely no idea what was going to happen in the world in the last 10 years in America, I don't think. But we can definitely draw some parallels between the politician here and a certain politician in America. This book is written, obviously, in the modern day. Joe Hill's written this in 2025, although I actually think that he may have written it a couple of years before, obviously, because it's so big before we got to publication. But I think that the reason that he's using this politician from 1979 is he's actually trying to, make a link between current day politicians. And by doing that, he's kind of unveiling the backgrounds of our main characters in this novel and where they might sit politically, or where their parents might have sit politically. And I think that if you've never read The Dead Zone, that's going to be much harder for you to understand in this novel. But if you have read The Dead Zone and you know what Greg Stilson is about, you can really easily see straight away what point is being made in King Sorrow by mentioning Greg Stilson, I think. So I think, that's a really interesting Easter egg that we have in there, because actually, you might actually want to go and read The Dead Zone to try and understand about Greg Stilson and, John Smith as a character, and what's actually really being said about them in King Sorrow, like how it's being used in relation to our characters in here. So that's one pretty major link between, our current book King Sorrow and an older book, which is Stephen King's, which is The Dead Zone. We also have a link, as I said before, I think, to Derry, which is the main town in It, because there are two prisons in King Sorrow, and in one of them we have somebody working in there called Bill Hanscom, and we only see this character for literally 2 lines. He's just dealing with a prisoner that's being released. But in It, we had a character called Ben Hanscom. And the last time we saw Ben Hanscom in the It novel by Stephen King was in 1985. Which means that in the part of the story where we see Bill Hanscom, that's in 2015. So that's 30 years between Ben Hanscom and Bill Hanscom, which leads me to think that Bill Hanscom might be the son of Ben Hanscom. And I don't think this is too much of a far-fetched idea, because in It, Ben Hanscom's best friend from childhood was Bill Denborough. So it kind of makes sense that he might have killed his son, Bill, after his best friend. So again, I feel like that's another link into the Stephen King universe that Joe Hill has done. So that's really, really interesting as well. And then we also have another link that I think I found. So a lot of the action in King Sorrow goes on in the Brooks Library. Now, in Shawshank Redemption, which I literally, again, read at the beginning of this month because I read that novella in the first week of King Family February, we also have a lot of stuff happening in the library in the Shawshank Penitentiary. And that library is called the Brooks Hatton Memorial Library. So again, I don't think that that's an accident when we start looking at all the Easter eggs in this novel that are like clear links to Stephen King books, to then say that the naming of the library is then an accident. I think that there is some kind of link, and I think what the link is, in the Shawshank Redemption, a lot of the prisoners undergo a sort of transformation in that library, either an academic transformation or an emotional, social transformation, just by, you know, having access to books and having that social time that they're spending with each other in the library, having the potential, you know, to sort out that their you know, their legal problems in the library with the main character Andy Dufresne, and also, you know, passing certain high school qualifications that do in that library. So all the men in there are going through a major transformation in the Brooks Hatton Memorial Library, I think. But also in the Brooks Library in King's Sorrow, our characters are going through major transformations. You know, the library is used at various points throughout the decades for certain things to happen. And, you know, the characters getting to know themselves better, coming up against challenges in that library and getting to know each other better in that library. So again, I think that there is a link, and I think it's to do with transformation. So I would say that I would have a critique of this book. So we have 3 main female characters. We have Ali Shiner, Donna McBride, and then we have Gwen Underfoot in this book. And I really liked all 3 characters, but I did find that the speech in this book was very similar between all 3 ladies, but they weren't similar characters, they were actually completely different characters. And Donna is one of the most brash of the 3 of them, and in her speech she's normally, you know, quite rude, she can be quite aggressive, and she swears quite a lot, you know, so, you know, she's just not the politest of people. And Gwen is a much quieter character. She's more liberal than Donna is, you know, and she's quite quiet about her sexuality as well, compared to Donna, who's quite loud and you know, out about it in her speech and the way that she talks. And there's a couple of scenes where Gwen is working with her employer, who is an elderly man, and she's having a couple of conversations with him, but the way that she's talking to him, you would think that Donna was in the room talking to him. You know, she's quite brash and vulgar, I suppose, in her speech, but that doesn't really match her character. So I do think that, you know, some of the conversations are quite funny, actually, some of the vulgar conversations that I had in this book, but I do think that Joe Hill should have been a little bit more careful about who he was attributing them to, and maybe just attributed them to Donna, because I do feel sometimes that, you know, there was a funny line that could happen in a scene and he gave it to like Ali or Gwen to say, but it didn't really fit their personality. So yeah, I did feel like the women, all their speech was maybe a little bit too similar, and that, you know, that could have been maybe what's the word? I think he could have just put their personality and characteristics into their speech and made them different, because they were actually 3 completely different characters, and he built them up really well in the book to be different characters. It's just when they open their mouths, they sound very similar to each other. I think that's what I'm trying to say. But generally, on the whole, I think that the characters were built really well in this book, and I think that their relationships with each other were written really well as well. Although I did find it a little bit annoying how much interbreeding, let's say, was going on between them all, but then again, that they all shared similar traumas and had been, you know, known each other, you know, for over 40 years, I think, by the time this book finishes. So, you know, maybe it's not unrealistic to think that they would all look to each other for that kind of comfort. I don't really know. And with regards to the pacing in this book, obviously it's a really, really good book, but we have different sections in the book. So, you know, we have like one section which is like attributed to one character, and then we'll kind of get in the head of another character for a bit in another section. And I think each section is roughly about 100 pages long. And I really liked the way that that was done, and I felt that the pacing was quite good, because, you know, you'd have a different event that, you know, a character would have to face within each section. So it would like sort of start off slow and then escalate and then, you know, come to a conclusion, and then we would next, you know, get to the next chapter. Or if there was no conclusion, we would then be switching into the next character for their point of view on the current, you know, event that the characters were facing. And I found that to be absolutely fine. I do know that other people online have said that they found it a little bit slow, and a lot of people maybe gave up at the halfway mark, but I really didn't feel like that at all. I really felt I was having a good time reading this book. I do wonder if it makes a difference if you are a Stephen King reader when you're reading King Sorrow, as to how easy it is to follow through with the book, because I said I was kind of Easter egg hunting as well. I didn't go into the book purposefully to do that, but then when the gunslinger references occurred at the beginning of the book, and also the reference to Greg Stilson, I kind of realised that there were Easter eggs in there. So I was kind of like reading the book with two agendas. One, I was like, right, there's obviously Stephen King references in here, so I'm going to try and find them as I'm reading. But I was also really interested in the story that was being told, and I was really, you know, interested to find out how we would, you know, resolve this issue that we had with this dragon. So yeah, I think Joe Hill did a really, really good job. You know, it is an investment to read a book this big. I'm not going to lie. I think that if you haven't read it yet and you are a Stephen King fan, I would recommend that you read The Dead Zone first, because then you're going to understand the references about the politics and how Greg Stilson is involved, I think. I don't think you need to read it before you read this. I just think that those little Easter eggs I found in there, they're just nods to that book. But, you know, understanding Greg Stilson is probably quite important, and can't really get too much into him in this review without giving away spoilers for The Dead Zone, so I'm not going to do that. But overall, I think that I would rate this a 4.5. The only reason that I wouldn't rate this as a 5 is I said I think some of the speech could have maybe had a little bit more work done on it, just to separate our female characters a little bit more, you know, because I think that when you are creating characters, you almost should be able to read their speech by the time you're on page 600 and know that that's that character talking without having to have said Donna or said Ali, and I'm not always sure that I could have done that. But no, it was really, really good. I had a really, really good time reading this. So I'm really happy that I picked this up for week 3. I think that next week, so this coming week now, we have our last week of King Family February, and I'm not entirely sure that I want to go back to The Curator by Owen King, but what I was meant to do was to read Sleeping Beauties, which is a joint novel written by Stephen King and Owen King together, and I am just not in the mood for it. I haven't forgotten how boring I found The Curator. I don't really want to go into this week and think that I'm going to pick up something else that I might not like. I really need a couple of months probably between the disappointment of The Curator before I would try Sleeping Beauties. I might be completely wrong and that book might be really enjoyable, but right now that's just not what I'm kind of thinking I want to do. So I think for this last week, I'm going to focus on Stephen King, like I did in the first week of King Family February, and pick up some more Stephen King novels. There are 3 that I'm currently drawn to. So I'm trying to decide, should I pick up The Wastelands, which is the 3rd in our Dark Tower series, because I've read 1 and 2 in week 1. So do we go with Roland? I'm thinking about picking up The Shining, which is one of Stephen King's classics, and it's not one that I've actually read yet, so I feel like I'd be in for a really good read for that. But I'm also thinking about picking up The Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. I think reading Joe Hill's dragon novel has just made me think actually I kind of fancy to keep reading on about dragons, so maybe I'll read Stephen King's one. So I actually kind of like the idea of reading all 3 of those. So in order to make a decision, I have written all 3 names on a piece of paper, so I don't know if you can see them in there, and I'm going to randomly pick one out now on camera, and that's the one I'm going to read this week. I might have time to read another one of them in this week, but we'll see, because maybe I'll just have a second wind with The Curator and try and finish off the Owen King one. Okay, so it looks like we're going to read The Eyes of the Dragon. So I'm very excited about that. I'm actually really in the mood for dragons now, and I think it'll be really good to compare Joe Hill's King Sorrow with Stephen King's The Eyes of the Dragon, and let's see who wrote a better dragon story. So I've had a really good reading week this week. I've really enjoyed the 2 books that I've read. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read either House of Monstrous Women by Daphne Farmer and what you thought of it, or Joe Hill's King Sorrow and what you thought of that. Also, let me know if you've read King Sorrow and you found other Easter eggs that I haven't come across. I really enjoyed Easter egg hunting in this book, but I'm absolutely sure I haven't got all of them because I haven't read all of Stephen King's novels, so I really don't know. There could be a lot of stuff that I haven't picked up on yet. So I'd be really keen to know if you know of any more, so I can then go back and look for them. If you've enjoyed this video, please press the thumbs up button, and if you'd like to see my future content, please press the subscribe button. Thank you for watching this video. I've really enjoyed making it, and hopefully I will see you Thursday for a video, or I'll see you next Monday when I do my next weekly update. Thanks for watching. Bye!